From the News Channel 5 Network, this is MorningLine with Nick Barris.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MorningLine on this Monday. I hope you had a good weekend. And if you're joining us now, you could be following us either on the Plus, all right, or you can be watching right now streaming live on Facebook at News Channel 5 if you'd like to join us there as well. I'll be monitoring there if you want to make any comments or questions. We have a good show on tap for you. Later in the program, we'll be joined by Dr. William Schaffner over at Vanderbilt, one of the foremost experts on infectious diseases in the country. I've been interviewing him for years, and he's one of many doctors that we've heard from, but boy, he's at the national level as well. I mean, he's been doing a lot of the national media. We've got some new developments. I'm going to ask him about convalescent plasma that the president announced yesterday and much more. And your chance to ask him questions direct. Dr. Schaffner will be coming up later, but as many of you know right now as well, school is back up and running, all right, in Tennessee, in Kentucky, and elsewhere. Some virtually, some back in classrooms. Concerns about students and teachers, things depending on where you are, going well, maybe not so well. We're going to get into that this morning with the first guest of the day, and that's going to be joined by Beth Brown now. Hopefully we'll have good audio. She's president of the Tennessee Education Association. Can you hear me okay, ma'am?
I can. Good morning, Nick.
Loud and clear. All right. Well, thank you for coming on. Listen, a lot of ground to cover here, and we'll put the phone number up if folks want to join in the conversation as well. But let me just ask you now that we're in a few days, obviously, into the new school year, depending on which county and where you're at. But what is your take right now, just superficially, of how things are going right now with returning to school?
Well, TEA is hearing from members all across the state with kind of mixed feelings. First of all, I think educators are thrilled to be back in school in whatever capacity that is. There are some concerns that linger. However, as we have started back in school, particularly for in-person instruction in a number of districts, and we are starting to see COVID cases pop in classrooms and in schools and in districts. And so those protocols that districts have developed are being tested, and educators and students are just trying to figure out how to manage and cope when the coronavirus is starting to pop up in our classrooms.
A lot of different ways we can go with this story this morning. I wanted to ask you this first. From your perspective, what does it mean now that teachers have been deemed to be essential? What does that mean, and what impact does that have on teachers, or what could it mean one way or the other?
Well, essential worker designation is an attempt to get around quarantine and isolation protocols in the event of COVID exposure in schools. We know without a doubt that there will be COVID exposure in schools. TEA strongly opposes school boards designating education staff as essential workers. It significantly increases the risk to the health, safety, and well-being of educators and students alike.
So essentially what this means is, since you're deemed an essential worker, if there is a positive test, unless you're someone who tests positive for it, because you're essential, you would not be required to quarantine just because you may have been around another individual that had it. Is that the way you understand it? Meaning that it would force, in a way, teachers to stay on the job even if they felt they were at risk having been near someone with it?
Yes, the essential worker designation requires educators to report to work even if they've been exposed to COVID-19. It doesn't necessarily require a positive test result, but if they've been exposed, then they aren't required to come to work. What's alarming about that is the fact that we know that there are many people who may not exhibit symptoms, who may not be tested, but who may in fact be carriers of the virus, who are then exposing their students and their colleagues. And so this workaround quarantine protocol is significantly increasing the risk to educators and students.
So what are you telling teachers teachers on how to handle it? And does the policy vary from district to district, or is it in your mind statewide, since I guess it came from the governor? Because for instance, as a journalist, I've been deemed an essential employee, but our Scripps company here I think has been very, very responsible. And if for some reason I come across someone who maybe had it and I was exposed, maybe don't have it, I stay home, and they're requiring it, okay? Even though I'm essential, it's an option, and I'm not going to be here taking any chance of infecting anyone else. So what about teachers? What is their choice on how they handle it?
Well, educators in districts that have adopted this policy, and right now there are only a handful who have adopted this policy, but they don't have that choice. They are forced to come to work after they've been exposed. And you know, it just seems nonsensical to designate educators as essential employees and eliminate quarantine as a virus-fighting tool to slow the spread of COVID-19. Every common sense guideline indicates that if you've been directly exposed to the virus, isolating for a period of time and getting tested are critical steps to reduce and prevent community spread. We need to prevent community spread. That is the only way that we're going to be able to reopen our school buildings for in-person instruction with any comfort of knowledge that it is going to be safe for our students and our educators.
Okay. Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we know that infectious disease experts are very clear that asymptomatic carriers of the virus are still highly contagious. And just because an asymptomatic carrier has not experienced any negative or difficult symptoms doesn't mean that the next person won't.
Okay. Now we know that many students are, learning virtually to start things off. Many school districts going in phases. Others that are having classes requiring masks, social distancing to the degree that they can. How do you think that is working in terms of the social distancing? I've heard like some schools staggering, classes ending so that you don't have the huge rush with the crowded hallways. Have you heard from some of the teachers saying that seems to be working? And are the students doing a good job wearing these masks when they have to in class?
Reports on that are mixed across the state. I do know that schools are working very hard to make sure that the protocols that they put in place and their attempts at social distancing are implemented with fidelity. The bottom line, we have to realize that schools were designed for social inclusion, not social distancing. So any attempt for social distancing is naturally a challenge. But educators have been very creative about how to accomplish that in their classrooms, how to accomplish that in the schools. And we're seeing, as we see COVID-19 cases popping up in our schools, we are seeing districts implementing their contact tracing procedures and protocols and identifying those who have been exposed.
What have you heard so far with regard to, and it's early on, some outbreaks, if there have been any? I know there was a report out of Smyrna where there were, several students and teachers maybe that they were looking at. To this point, and maybe it's still early, have you heard of many across the state?
Yes, we've heard from several. We know in Upper East Tennessee that there have been several diagnoses in an exposure among staff that pushed reopening back. They postponed in-person instruction and began remotely. So that we heard several cases of that have been in Upper East Tennessee. We also heard from Upper East Tennessee some districts that decided to postpone school reopening until after Labor Day. And then here in Middle Tennessee, in Rutherford County, we heard of several schools that had to be closed, school buildings that had to be closed due to significant exposure. And we're starting to see some things over in West Tennessee. I heard late last week, that there's a rural district that is having to transition to remote learning because they have had so many cases pop up in the schools.
I got you. And when the cases do pop up in the schools, not only is the quarantine and the isolation, but you really have to go in, don't you, and clean the school. I mean, the whole school has to be cleansed before they can go back and do classroom, and that takes time as well.
Absolutely.
All right. Now, just another question before we take our first break, and we'll come back with questions and comments on Facebook as well. The virtual learning aspect of it, obviously we know there are a lot of students staying home on that. I think initially there were some bugs, which was to be expected with some of the computers and the Zoom classes. But does that appear to be settling down and working within the capacity and kids getting a decent education virtually?
That is my understanding. Anytime you roll out something that's that comprehensive, that's that expansive, and includes that many people with technology, there are always going to be some challenges with the rollout. But my understanding in the different districts that have done that, they've settled in and are doing well. I mean, obviously, virtual learning is not any educator's preferred method. We would all love to be back in our classrooms with our students, but we will do whatever it takes to make sure that our students and colleagues can remain healthy.
And that really is the key. Your greatest fear right now is not only that you have the outbreaks, and we haven't heard of teachers or young students yet, at least with regard to schools opening now in just the past few weeks, being hospitalized or becoming critically ill. As we know, some could. Many others could require very little treatment and recover, and others maybe be asymptomatic. But is that your biggest fear, that we're going to have teachers ending up in the hospital, or perhaps even young students?
Absolutely. Our data shows that 1 in 4 Tennessee educators is in a high-risk category. We know that schools cannot operate without the adults, and so making sure that we can keep a healthy workforce, that we respect our professionals and their safety, as well as the safety of their own families, is critical.
Yeah, we hear so much right now about protecting the students, but at the same time, it's very, very important as well, equally, to protect the teachers and staff at these schools to keep everything up and running. Listen, we'll take a quick break, Beth, and when we come back, we've got some phone calls, and we'll go over some more of the things that you see developing right now moving forward as more and more students heading back to school, either in the classroom or virtually. We'll be back more with Beth Brown, Tennessee Education Association, right after this. Stay with us.